So the parable of the Good Samaritan is one of, if not the most well-known of Jesus' parables. It is the namesake of hospitals, ministries, safe houses, and programs providing care to vulnerable populations. The contents of this well-known parable have also been drawn upon by royals, heads of state, and leaders of all types who wish to highlight acts of kindness and good deeds as necessary to a thriving society. If one needs a story that fosters and encourages care for the other, this is the story for such things. This image that we have here is a painting by Vincent van Gogh, and it depicts the part of the story where the Samaritan is helping lift the man from the ditch onto his donkey. This man doing good by using his resources to help another. Well, we could probably just end the sermon there, and maybe that's what you were hoping for. But as Jesus says, go and do likewise. Go and serve the least, the lost, and the lonely. And we're not wrong in that, to go and do as the Samaritan does. Surely the goodness that we see in the Samaritan is something that we should emulate. Being moved to act with compassion in self-sacrificial ways is the way of Jesus, especially when it comes to the marginalized, the beaten down, tossed aside, and the left for dead. But I think this might be an important question for us to ponder. What is a parable? If you look it up in its most basic sense, parables are simple stories told through simple and relatable characters, which lead us to a moral good. However, to its original audience, these stories are anything but basic, and rather both baffle and scandalize its hearers. So one of the most fascinating aspects of a parable is that there is never only one way to interpret them. And it's perhaps our over-familiarity, like with the parable of the Good Samaritan, that make it easy to reduce the parable down to a singular meaning, resulting in once provocative stories becoming domesticated by us. So how should we engage with parables? One Jewish approach has been to think of it like looking through a kaleidoscope, where with a change in the light or with one slight turn of the wrist, the whole picture changes before our eyes. Like the lawyer in this text, maybe the goal of the parables for us has too often been to extrapolate the meaning in neat and tidy ways. Giving quick answers and easy applications, drawing one-to-one correlations becomes our task. So who am I in this parable, we ask ourselves. This week, as I spent time with this text, a text that I have spent much time with in the past, but this time I was left wondering something new. What if I was a little bit like the lawyer? I wondered if this parable for me had been a tool by which I could rest easily in my own good deeds, that it had become something useful for me to examine myself through, more that and less of an invitation to see what God is doing in the world. So what must I do to inherit eternal life?" the lawyer asks. And Jesus answers, "What is written in the law?" In true to Jesus' form, he answers a question with a question. And the lawyer responds, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." These words were to be written on the heart of every Jewish person. The central Jewish prayer known as the Shema, which was prayed every morning and every night. See, every Jewish person, when they hear Jesus' question, what is written in the law? When it comes to neighbors, when it comes to love, every Jewish person knew that this was the answer to give. But the lawyer had not finished, as he interjects, again in an effort to weaken Jesus' teaching. And he asks, "And who is my neighbor?" However, in his efforts to expose Jesus, he actually ends up exposing his own vulnerability. And that is the belief that belonging is conditional. See, the question behind the question, "Who is my neighbor?" is really, where am I allowed to draw the boundaries of my love so that it can keep out all the wrong kinds of people? At what point is it justifiable to withhold compassion, care, and concern for the other? Who is it acceptable to cease beholding as human? See, this dialogue between Jesus and the lawyer, this is all happening at a time of great social, religious, and ethnic polarization. I mean, not that we could relate to any of that today. But of course, we all know that that's not true. We see the headlines. We see the things that are happening. We hear the things that are happening in our world today. And for a Jewish person at this time, Samaritans are enemies. They're considered impure. They reject the teachings of the prophets. They worshiped in wholly different ways and failed every litmus test of Jewish righteousness. For the Samaritan to be the one doing the good thing in this story was highly, highly offensive. And I wonder if that caught even the disciples by surprise. I mean, they had just come up against opposition from Samaritans. These are the same people that we heard about just a couple weeks ago, the same people that James and John thought deserved fire to be called down upon their heads. And now their rabbi is making them the hero of a story. See, we've all experienced the ways in which we inflict deep pain on each other, intended or not. The wounds cut deep. And sometimes what we really want, sometimes what I really want, is for Jesus just to be on my side. To see the list of those people in my head that I want to exclude, and just give me the go-ahead to do that. Now, I'm not advocating for allowing ourselves to be in any kind of dangerous or abusive situations. If we want to know what side Jesus is on, he is always on the side of the oppressed. If we want to know where Jesus stands, it is always with victims of injustice. Full stop. What we need to know is that God's wholeness is outrageous, and it is happening in the most outrageous ways. And we may be a little on the fence of who and what is being made whole again, but Jesus is not on the fence. The Holy Spirit will not be bound by our uncertainties of where wholeness can reach. I also find it fascinating in this parable that the only person without an identity is the victim of this story. It's the man in the ditch. I mean, we don't know anything about him. We don't know his profession, his belief system. Does he have a family waiting for him back at home? Or perhaps nobody even knows he's missing. How long has he even been there? Does he have the money to pay back the Samaritan? Or did the robbers take the last of what he had to his name? See, this man in the ditch, he is both nobody and he is everybody, because he is Christ. He is Jesus himself, bloodied and beaten and left for dead. In the eyes of the passerby, as he gazes upon his broken body, he's just a loser. Robert Farrar Capon says, he's a loser because messiahs don't die. In Matthew 25:35-40, it says, when the Son of Man comes into his glory, he will put the goats on his left and the sheep on his right, and he will call to those on his right to receive their inheritance. And he will say to them, for I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me. And then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothed you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go and visit you? And the king will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. See, this parable of the Good Samaritan, it is about care for the least, for the lost and the lonely. But more than that, as Capon puts it, it is about the truly bizarre working of the mystery of redemption. See, the lawyer, Robert Farrar Capon says, the lawyer is told by Jesus, in effect, to stop trying to live and be willing to die, to be willing to be lost rather than to be found, to be, in short, a neighbor to the one who, in the least of his brethren, is already a neighbor to a whole world of losers. So the lawyer's question, who is my neighbor? It's never actually answered explicitly. Perhaps because the question's intent is really just to create categories. If being a neighbor becomes less about the category of proximity and more about the ways of being in all human interactions. Well, what does that mean for our communities? What does it look like to have a culture of neighboring? One of the most modern influential people in this regard is the late ordained minister and beloved television pastor Fred Rogers. Most of you in this room probably recognize him, have watched his television show. His television show is Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, which aired on public broadcasting in 1968 and aired for 31 seasons before it went into syndication. Can you remember that opening theme song? Is it playing through your head as I speak? The last lines of this theme song is he comes through that front door and puts on his sweater every morning is, would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? And of course, this is being aired across the nation and eventually across borders, resulting in an invitation by Mr. Rogers to be neighbors without regard to proximity. One of the things that ignited Fred Rogers' ministry was the common belief that children were reduced to who they would be someday, who they would become eventually. The value was placed on children based on who they would be in the future, not on their inherent value in the moment. And Fred believed that there was inherent value in every person, maybe especially children. And so his show took on topics like race inequality, death, divorce, and really any subject that a child might be facing. He believed that every child deserved to have access to this kind of messaging, and so he fought to keep it accessible on public television, eventually convincing Congress to greenlight the funding to make that possible. But as good as that sounds to all of us, he was not without his critics, who bemoaned the evils of telling a generation of children that belonging was inherent and not earned. This was fundamental to his theology, that the worth of a person, despite any of their own efforts or failures, had inherent worth. Fred believed we could treat everyone as though we belonged to each other, that our human flourishing depended on each other, and that one person being denied dignity meant that we were all degraded. This image right here is one of the more popular images, so it might be familiar to you. But if it isn't, this was an episode that first aired after a horrific race-motivated attack that happened at a public swimming pool. And Fred believed that given the opportunity, children would be able to grasp what it is to truly embody mercy and live as neighbors to one another. I think one of the things that this parable reveals to us is a new kind of abundance. I don't mean new like in the history of humans, because I think it's really just new to us. It's the kind of abundance that God has always planned for humans from the beginning. And it's an abundance that is going to resist the notion that our flourishing depends on what we can make of ourselves. The do better, work harder, individual striving we are used to, it leaves no room for neighbors. See, because the Samaritan depended on the hospitality of the innkeeper. The innkeeper depended on the honesty of the Samaritan. And the man in the ditch depended on the mercy of strangers. See, the abundance that Jesus calls us to requires us to be fully dependent on Christ. Christ calls us to receive him as both Samaritan and the unnamed loser at the side of the road. So what does it look like for us to be a neighboring people? Leaning into the past few weeks of teaching, we know that it doesn't look like sameness. That it looks like unity in our differences. Like in our parable today, our call to be a neighbor has one category, and that is human. Our concern is to be a neighbor for whomever it is we encounter, because society's categories of worth will eventually crumble beneath the weight of God's wholeness. So in a few moments, we're going to come to the table together. And so come and bring with you those parts of you who identify with the feeling of being broken, beaten up, robbed, cast aside. Because Jesus knows what it is to be rejected. But know that he is also our rescuer. He is the one who finds us half dead and makes us alive again. At the table, we encounter Christ as our wounded healer, because he is both the unnamed man and the Good Samaritan. And he calls us to be those things in his presence and to each other. And all of us are invited to encounter him. So Jesus asks, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell in the hands of robbers? And the expert in the law said, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus told him, go and do likewise.